Watergate. That's what I'd like to talk about today in the history video. The term Watergate could either specifically mean the burglary of the Democratic headquarters and the subsequent cover-up that led to Nixon's almost impeachment and resignation from office, but really what it refers to is a broad range of scandals in the Nixon administration. We have to realize that back then there was no such thing as campaign finance reform. There were no reportings, there were no records, there were no limitations. Everything was done in cash, suitcases of cash. Nobody kept track of campaign money. Nobody knew who gave it. Nobody knew how it was used. Nobody knew where it went. And in that environment, Nixon pushed it to the limits with a whole series of scandals. He took $400,000 from a major American company to sponsor the convention, a Republican convention, and nobody knows where that money went. He was constantly awash in cash. Midway in his administration, they imposed rules limiting the use of cash, and Nixon raised cash like crazy until that deadline, squeezing in as much as he possibly could. But the real sin of Richard Nixon was toward his enemies. And when we look at Hillary's enemies list and we look at Chris Christie's revenge against the mayor of Fort Lee, we've got to take that very seriously, given the backdrop of Richard Nixon. He used every federal agency he could to harass and degrade and intimidate his political opponents. The IRS audited them, the FBI investigated them. He had a special White House plumbers unit that would wiretap them. He stopped at nothing to use all of the powers of the federal government against his political adversaries. It was a ruthless us versus them fight, waged by a president who saw enemies around every corner. Finally, it got out of hand when in June of 1972, 4 months before the election, a team of burglars, many of them Cuban exiles, burst into the Democratic National Committee offices to bug them, to wiretap them. And fortunately, they were discovered by a security guard who was passing by. They were arrested, hauled into court. And the administration originally said we had nothing to do with it. But then it turned out that the burglars were paid by operatives that were connected with the Nixon administration. And a whole series of denouements unfolded over a period of 2 entire years. The big break came when it was revealed that Nixon had a taping system installed in the White House to keep a historical record of his conversations. And the special prosecutor who Nixon had appointed to investigate this scandal, Archibald Cox, subpoenaed these records, and Nixon fired him rather than turn them over. And eventually a new prosecutor was appointed, the public demanded it, a new subpoena was issued, Nixon turned over transcripts and eventually turned over some of the tapes. And it turned out there was an 18-minute gap in one of the tapes at a crucial period which Nixon had obviously erased because it had incriminating stuff on it. Finally, the United States Supreme Court got the case. And even though a lot of the appointees were appointed by President Nixon in a 9-0 decision, they said, you have to produce those tapes. Nixon did, and on the tapes was a very explicit order to his chief of staff, Bob Haldeman, to pay cover-up money to the Watergate burglars so that they wouldn't talk and so that they wouldn't spill the beans about their connection with the administration. That was the smoking gun. That led the House Committee, Judiciary Committee, to vote articles of impeachment. He never actually got impeached because once they voted that, the Republican leaders, led by Barry Goldwater, went to the White House and said, Mr. President, you have to resign. Your public opinion polling is down in the 20s. You no longer have the confidence of this country. You've got to leave. And Nixon, in August of 1974, became the first president in history, and we hope the last, to actually resign his office. In the meantime, Nixon's vice president, Spiro Agnew, had been indicted for bribery. He had taken, not as vice president, but as county executive in Maryland, and he'd taken all kinds of bribes, secreted them in his office, and he pled nolo contendere, and he resigned as vice president. Nixon appointed Gerald Ford in his place, who was the House Republican leader, And Ford then became president, and he appointed Nelson Rockefeller as his vice president. The most traumatic scandals to rock American democracy since Andrew Johnson's impeachment during Reconstruction, which we dealt with a couple of months ago in our history videos. The final chapter was that when Ford took office, one of the first things he did was to pardon Richard Nixon, spare him any prosecution. There was almost a consensus at the time that there was a political deal between Ford and Nixon to effect that pardon. In retrospect, there probably was not a deal, but Ford was a very loyal guy. He'd been appointed by Nixon, and he wasn't going to leave Nixon hanging out there. And he felt that it was necessary to put the scandal behind the country and move ahead and try to rebuild the fabric and the framework of our democracy. Thanks for watching.